The paper trail. Let's go, 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 go. Yeah, 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 yeah. For the love of money, niggas come around. For the love of money, some stay around. For the love of money, what a nigga will do. For the love of the money, yeah. I gotta shake it, 12 at night to 5 in the morning. They don't give a fuck now. If it's for that money, niggas gon' bark and they bite like a motherfucking dog. Gotta party like a motherfucking dog. For that cat, I am gon' roof and I'm barking at that cat, and I am gon' take the roof off when I'm riding that ride. Rip nigga to the left, but I'm steady on the only right. I'm swerving with a purpose, for the purpose. A nigga been sipping on that purple. A nigga been cheaping on that purple. Cause I'm getting money, I'm getting money. Cause I'm getting money. And I'm laughing all the way to the motherfucking bank. And I'm telling her, tell me later if she thinking what I'm thinking. Damn, me getting money. I walk about the bank and I stuck up in the wheel. Headed to my next big destination. Somewhere where I'm going.
Lots of questioners want to know whether you share Congressman Ron Paul's skepticism of the Fed. And I'm going to quote you. This isn't in basic economics, but a recent column. Quote, for most of the history of this country, there was no Federal Reserve System. There you go, that dirty trick of bringing in history.
Oh, yes.
There was no Federal Reserve System, which was established in 1914 to prevent bank failures. But bank failures in the 1930s exceeded anything ever seen before the Fed was established, close quote. If we could make you dictator, would you abolish the Fed?
Yes.
You would.
There's no, the Fed represented wonderful hope. It's so many programs that represented wonderful hopes that ended in disaster. I don't doubt that someone who is sufficiently scholarly could come up with examples of where the Federal Reserve made things better. But the question is, overall, what was it supposed to do? It was supposed to not only prevent bank failures, it was supposed to prevent huge changes in the money supply, in particular, great deflations. The
Right.
greatest deflation in American history occurred under the Federal Reserve System. You know, there was a crisis in 1907. J.P. Morgan, the original J.P. Morgan, called the other bankers into a room, supposedly locked the doors, and said, "We've got to do something, or we're going to all collapse." And they did something, and they didn't all collapse. But the progressives were shocked that one man could come in and take command of the situation, and especially someone who wasn't even in the government.
Right. So, so what would you do? You'd move us back to the gold standard, or you'd let banks issue their own currencies the way they did
as the time the Federal Reserve was created. We were on the gold standard, though. But whether we're on or off the gold standard, that's another whole set of arguments. There's no evidence that I can see that over this vast period of time,
their own currencies the way they did up through the Civil War, say? I could.
Well, they weren't doing any of those things as the time the Federal Reserve was created. We were on the gold standard, though. But whether we're on or off the gold standard, that's another whole set of arguments. There's no evidence that I can see that over this vast period of time that the Federal Reserve has existed, that things on the whole have been better. The great post-World War II inflation was fed by the Federal Reserve doing exactly what they're planning to do now, namely buying up the bonds issued by the Treasury.
But don't you have, I have to say, I wasn't expecting your answer to run in this direction, so I don't have follow-up questions prepared, or I may actually have to think here in real time. But don't we have the example of that period from 83 through a couple of years ago, that 25 years of economic expansion? We had only two downturns. They were both very shallow and very brief. And what you had was Paul Volcker, whom Carter appointed, but Reagan gave the freedom actually to wring inflation out of the currency. He did that by the mid-'80s. The economy takes off. Alan Greenspan does a reasonably good job. And then at the end, there's too much money but maybe 5 years of getting it wrong. So
what Volcker did was undo the harm that previous Federal Reserves had done.
Including Arthur Burns.
Yeah, unfortunately, who was my teacher and one whom I much admired.
Right. So, but what would you replace it with? How would the currency? How would the currency run?
We would replace it. We could replace it with what existed when it was created,
which was the gold standard.
Well, it may be the gold standard, but maybe not. But there's no evidence that what would you replace it? Things always bother me. You know,
they do?
When someone removes the cancer, what do you replace it with?
Okay.
Shipping manifests from 1879 that document something troubling about the orphan trains. I was researching American child welfare history when these documents surfaced in a collection of transportation records housed at the National Railroad Historical Society, preserved in climate-controlled storage alongside thousands of shipping manifests, freight schedules, and logistical documentation that chronicles the massive expansion of American railroad infrastructure during the late 19th century. Standard historical research examining how the Children's Aid Society organized the mass relocation of urban children to rural areas during the late 19th century, trying to understand the scope and impact of what historians consider one of America's most significant social reform movements. The research had led me through extensive documentation of humanitarian efforts to address urban poverty, overcrowding, and child welfare crises that characterized American cities during the industrial expansion period. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, pioneered systematic programs to relocate children from eastern urban centers to western rural communities where they could be placed with families willing to provide homes, education, and opportunities for social advancement. The Orphan Train Program living in urban poverty. The manifest I discovered weren't for the well-documented orphan trains that historians routinely study when examining child welfare reform and westward child welfare crises that characterized American cities during the industrial expansion period. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, pioneered systematic relocate children from eastern urban centers to western rural communities where they could be placed with families willing to provide homes, education, and opportunities for social advancement. The Orphan Train program represented progressive thinking about child welfare, social mobility, and the benefits of rural life for children who had been living in urban poverty. The manifest I discovered weren't for the well-documented orphan trains that historians routinely study when examining child welfare reform and westward population distribution during America's period of territorial expansion and social modernization. Different shipments entirely. Railroad records documenting the transportation of children through routes and to destinations that don't align with the official orphan train program administered by Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society. Children shipped to locations that weren't participating in the organized placement program, traveling on schedules that didn't correspond to publicized placement events, and arriving at destinations where no families were expecting to receive them for adoption or agricultural apprenticeship arrangements. The standard orphan train narrative describes a humanitarian program designed to address urban poverty by relocating children from overcrowded eastern cities to rural western communities, where they would be placed with farm families needing labor and willing to provide homes for disadvantaged youth. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children participated in this migration program. But the 1879 shipping records document additional child transportation that operated parallel to the official program using similar railroad infrastructure but serving different destinations and purposes. Rate equals 84 pitch greater than minus 3%. The railroad manifests preserve remarkably detailed documentation of cargo shipments that included children alongside other freight being transported to industrial facilities, mining operations, and manufacturing centers throughout the American interior, creating a paper trail that reveals systematic coordination between transportation companies and industrial enterprises seeking workers for dangerous and difficult operations. Not the agricultural communities that characterized official orphan train placements, which were typically small farming towns where families sought children for household help and agricultural labor within traditional rural family structures. These children were being shipped to locations where industrial operations required workers for mining coal, producing steel, operating textile machinery, and building railroad infrastructure rather than communities seeking children for domestic integration within established family households. The shipping documentation reveals systematic processing of children through transportation networks that treated them as cargo rather than passengers receiving humanitarian assistance. Manifest entries document children by numbers rather than names, ages estimated in ranges rather than specific birth dates. Physical descriptions focused on work capability rather than individual identity, and destination information that referenced industrial facilities, rather than placement communities or receiving families. The children weren't traveling to new homes. They were being delivered to work sites as industrial resources. Each manifest entry provides disturbing details about the dehumanizing aspects of industrial child transportation that differed fundamentally from the humanitarian emphasis of official orphan train programs. Children grouped by estimated work capacity rather than age or family relationships. Transportation arrangements that prioritized cargo efficiency rather than passenger comfort or safety. Destination scheduling coordinated with industrial production needs rather than family placement convenience or community integration activities. The manifest document, level equals moderate, greater than systematic exploitation rather than charitable child welfare. Individual shipping records reveal the scope and systematic nature of industrial child placement operations that operated parallel to but completely separate from the humanitarian orphan train programs that received public attention and charitable support. Shipment 347B documented the transportation of 43 children ranging in estimated ages from 8 to 14 to coal mining operations in central Pennsylvania, with manifest notes describing their suitability for underground work and physical development appropriate for mining labor. Shipment 491A recorded the delivery of 37 children to textile manufacturing facilities in Massachusetts, with documentation emphasizing their manual dexterity for machinery operation and willingness to work extended shifts without complaint. Consider the logistics involved in organizing and funding child transportation to industrial destinations that weren't part of the official Children's Aid Society network. Railroad shipping required advance coordination between transportation companies, sending organizations, and receiving parties who would assume responsibility for the children upon arrival. Industrial facilities receiving children would have needed housing, supervision, and management systems designed to accommodate child worker. Time equals 600 milliseconds greater than rather than the family-based care arrangements that characterized traditional orphan train placements. The documentation was coordination between urban child gathering organizations and industrial enterprises that operated independently of the Children's Aid Society's oversight and placement procedures. Children collected from city streets, orphanages, and immigrant communities were being channeled into transportation networks that delivered them directly to work sites rather than to rural communities where placement agents would coordinate with local families interested in child adoption or agricultural labor arrangements. The industrial destinations documented in these shipping manifests weren't located in the agricultural frontier regions typically associated with orphan train settlement. Pennsylvania coal mines, Ohio steel mills, textile factories throughout New England, and railroad construction camps in territories that were being developed for resource extraction rather than family farming. These destinations required child workers for dangerous industrial operations rather than seeking children for family integration within established rural communities. The timing of these shipments coincides with rapid industrial expansion that created unprecedented demand for workers willing to accept dangerous conditions and minimal wages. The 1879 period marked intensive development of extractive industries, manufacturing operations, and transportation infrastructure projects that required large workforces but couldn't attract sufficient adult workers through normal labor recruitment methods. Child workers represented a solution to labor shortages that adult workers avoided due to dangerous conditions and exploitative compensation. Many children documented in these shipping manifests are described with characteristics that distinguish them from typical orphan train participants. Advanced physical development, suggesting ages older than documented. Technical skills indicating previous industrial experience rather than urban street backgrounds. Language capabilities suggesting education levels inconsistent with typical orphan populations. These weren't abandoned children being rescued from urban poverty. These were workers being transported to industrial operations that required specific capabilities and experience levels. The shipping documentation includes detailed inventories of supplies and equipment accompanying the child shipments that reveal the industrial nature of their intended employment. Tools, protective equipment, and technical materials consistent with mining, manufacturing, and construction operations rather than household goods or agricultural implements that would accompany children being placed with farm families. The children weren't being sent to families. They were being delivered to job sites as industrial workers. Who was organizing and funding this parallel child transportation network that operated alongside but separately from the official Children's Aid Society Orphan Train Program, and what institutional infrastructure enabled the systematic collection of children from urban areas and their delivery to industrial destinations throughout the American interior. The shipping manifests identify various charitable organizations, industrial enterprises, and transportation companies as responsible parties for coordinating these shipments, but the level of systematic organization required to collect children from multiple urban centers, arrange their transportation through complex railroad networks, and coordinate their delivery to specific industrial facilities suggests institutional coordination and financial resources that far exceeded what typical charitable or commercial operations could organize independently. The collecting organizations documented in these industrial child shipment manifests weren't established child welfare agencies with clear humanitarian missions, public accountability, or transparent funding sources that characterized legitimate charitable operations during this period. Instead, these organizations operated under names that suggested charitable purposes. The American Youth Settlements in suggests institutional coordination and commercial operations could organize independently. Industrial child shipment manifests weren't established child welfare agencies with clear humanitarian missions, public accountability, or transparent funding sources that characterized legitimate charitable operations during this period. Instead, these organizations operated under names that suggested charitable purposes. The American Youth Settlement Society, the Industrial Training Association, the Western Opportunity Foundation, but couldn't be traced through normal organizational records, government oversight documentation, or public information about their activities, leadership, or financial support that would typically be available for legitimate charitable organizations. These collecting organizations appeared specifically to gather children for industrial placement and disappeared from administrative documentation once their collection and transportation activities were completed, suggesting they were created temporarily to serve specific industrial labor needs rather than operating as ongoing charitable institutions with sustained missions and community accountability. The organizations functioned more like labor recruitment services than child welfare agencies. Time equals 700 milliseconds slash greater than using humanitarian rhetoric to legitimize operations that were fundamentally commercial rather than charitable. The systematic nature of child collection operations reveals sophisticated organizational capabilities and substantial financial resources that enabled coordination between multiple urban centers, railroad transportation networks, and industrial receiving facilities across vast geographical distances. In Philadelphia, Baltimore, and other eastern cities. Transportation coordination involving multiple railroad companies and complex scheduling
Bang bang. Birth of a who? Huh? Birth of a who? Well, well, well. Sticky, icky, 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 icky beginning. Yeah, yeah. Very, very sticky beginnings. Did I hear the word pay? I hear the word pay in the 1800s. Prior to 1865, huh? Just so happened the slave schedules came out 1850. When did these motherfucking boxcar kids get here? 1850s. Hmm? 1840s and 50s. Hmm? And what is this fake ass slave schedule they created in the 1900s? I'm saying they created it in the 1900s because even the 1850 census fake ass slave schedule didn't come out until 1942 also. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, maybe they were burning down their own records and then writing in their history. Is this the chronology, the Joseph Scalagarian chronology that we're hypnotized under right now, under this education that we're receiving, and it's being created also still in modern day times by the same people back then that is doing it now. The lineage is real. Huh. Talk to me. Or don't talk to me. It's about listening and playing a major part in this motherfucking stage play that you are in unbeknownst to your ass. You know what I mean? So, I'm gonna tell you what, I'm avoiding all those casting couches. You sick motherfuckers, you. Oh, so they didn't get acting and they're giving everything a bad name with these big headed Yakubian files that have dropped. They're giving everything a bad name. Music, movies, theater. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They've turned theater into theater. And mind you, I'm saying wasn't no 1865 war. Not if you just now. Not if you just starting to bring all these kids over here as workers. Where are these babies at? Where are the babies of the babies of the babies of these? Hmm? They have been built a Nordic race, a eugenic race. When they started bringing all of these workers over here, just imagine though if one of those workers that they brought over here. Now, mind you, again, prior to 1865, they are bringing these babies over here, huh? Mind you, we see tales of the incubator babies, right? Huh? Huh? Birth of a who? Huh? What? What in the HE double hockey sticks is going zone? What in the Pluto? What in the Mars? What in the Jupiter? Boy, they playing. They didn't even name one of them anus. Boy, get the out of here. Boy, I'm talking home run out of here. So they've built a race. Where did these babies come from? They've built a race of babies to come here and become workers. A full blown worker, not a halfway. They lied. They lied in history. They lied. They lied to you. They lied to you. They lied. It was kid workers here, not black Africans. Not none of that shit. Not none of that shit. No, no. These are kid workers of the European race, I would say, not of the African race. They said they couldn't find workers that would go to work for that type of pay. Boy, what they didn't did that for? Them boys the one that found some incubator babies. Boy, where you get them babies from? I'm just saying, where is 250 plus thousand? Boy, look at here. You wonder where the Creole nation came from. You wonder. Wait a minute. Stop it. Stop the press. I mean, the so-called. You don't see my bunny ears right now, do you? Maxwell was in control of all the printing press, propaganda press. Shh, propaganda press. Shh. I'm still doing the bunny ears the whole motherfucking time. But I don't mean it. I don't mean it. Parentheses that. Bang bang.
Road transportation networks, and industrial receiving facilities across vast geographical distances. Collecting agents working simultaneously in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and other eastern cities. Transportation coordination involving multiple railroad companies and complex scheduling to deliver children to specific industrial destinations. Communication networks enabling advanced coordination.
Bang bang. I'm back with vengeance, baby. Now, why is every city he just mentioned? Why is every city he just mentioned has everything to do with black mariners? Why are the communities of these black mariner families during the 1800s in those same cities running the ships? What is going on in this motherfucking building right now? Look at here. Everybody open a window if you're nearby what? Yeah, yeah, yeah. It might get set afire. I'm gonna tell you that right now. You're gonna need a place to jump out this motherfucker. The hot heat is heating up in this bitch. Why are the black mariners in these same said cities during the 1800s, might I add? See, this whole slavery story right now, I'm about to step on it. with little words and little action. I'll tell you right now, these marvelous boxcar boys. Boy, I'm gonna tell you right now. I'm gonna tell you right now. We don't know where Big Headed Yakub came from. I don't know where Big Headed Yakub came from, but that nigga's here. I'm gonna tell you right now. None of that. None of that. Show no fear to these games they play. If they want to tell us what's going on and keep it going on, shit, we gotta learn how to shake that. Bounce back with a hit back on some real shit. Look at here. As long as they can keep all of us divided, because at some point in time, the race got to be thrown out the motherfucking window. Hmm? We talking about in America only. We only talking about in America. There's some deeper roots here with us Aboriginals. Yeah. Some deeper roots in here with us. Yeah. So where's the motherfucking Africans right here in the 1800s when there should have been African slaves that could have worked these plantations and whatnot? What the fuck is going on? Why does an African look like a pale kid? A European kid to me? I'm just saying. Boy, y'all been lying to us. Birth of a motherfucking who? Birth of a motherfucking what? I'm watching you. Because why did your boy J.E. playing the same plan that they were playing? Why did your boy J.E. have these same plans with these killings? And he was sending them out to work for him too at different things. Now, pimp type gangs. Talk to me, shorty. And what was your antennas? Bang, bang.
These collecting organizations appeared specifically to gather children for industrial placement and disappeared from administrative documentation once their collection and transportation activities were completed, suggesting they were created temporarily to serve specific industrial labor needs rather than operating as ongoing charitable institutions with sustained missions and community accountability. The organizations functioned more like labor recruitment services than child welfare agencies. Time equals 700 milliseconds slash greater than using humanitarian rhetoric to legitimize operations that were fundamentally commercial rather than charitable. The systematic nature of child collection operations reveals sophisticated organizational capabilities and substantial financial resources that enabled coordination between multiple urban centers, railroad transportation networks, and industrial receiving facilities across vast geographical distances. Collecting agents working simultaneously in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and other eastern cities. Transportation coordination involving multiple railroad companies and complex scheduling to deliver children to specific industrial destinations. Communication networks enabling advanced coordination between collecting organizations and industrial facilities regarding the number, age ranges, and physical characteristics of children needed for different types of industrial work. The receiving industrial operations weren't typical family-owned farms or small businesses that might reasonably seek child workers as family members or apprentices. Large-scale extractive and manufacturing enterprises that required systematic labor management rather than individual family relationships with child workers. Coal companies operating multiple mine sites, steel producers managing complex manufacturing processes, textile operations with hundreds of workers, and railroad construction companies building infrastructure across vast geographical regions. Time equals 2 seconds, slash. The children transported through these industrial shipments weren't integrated into local communities where they could develop normal social relationships, educational opportunities, or pathways to adult independence and family formation. They were housed in company facilities, worked under industrial supervision, and maintained within institutional systems that provided minimal education, social development, or preparation for adult life outside industrial employment. This wasn't child placement. This was workforce development using child labor. The transportation routes documented in these manifests reveal the systematic nature of industrial child shipment, greater than, and the geographic scope of operations that extended far beyond the agricultural frontier regions typically associated with orphan train settlement. Children collected from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and other eastern urban centers were shipped not just to agricultural states like Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa, but to industrial regions throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and territories being developed for resource extraction in the Rocky Mountains and Pacific Northwest. The railroad companies facilitating these shipments weren't simply providing transportation services for humanitarian child placement programs. They were coordinating with industrial enterprises to provide workers for railroad construction projects. Time equals 700 milliseconds slash mining operations that supported railroad development and manufacturing facilities that produced materials and equipment for transportation infrastructure expansion. The children weren't passengers being transported to new homes. They were cargo being delivered to work sites that supported railroad industry expansion. Consider the economic calculations that made child workers attractive to industrial enterprises willing to pay transportation costs and provide housing for workers who couldn't be recruited through normal labor markets. Adult workers demanded wages that reflected the dangerous conditions and physical demands of industrial work. Child workers could be housed collectively in minimal facilities, fed basic rations, and compensated minimally or not at all while providing the same physical labor required for industrial operations. The working conditions documented in follow-up correspondence between industrial facilities and collecting organizations reveal systematic exploitation of child workers that violated emerging child welfare standards and labor regulations being implemented during the 1870s, as American society began recognizing the need for protection of vulnerable populations. 12-hour workdays in dangerous underground mining environments where cave-ins, gas explosions, and equipment accidents regularly killed and injured adult workers. Housing arrangements in company barracks with minimal sanitation, inadequate heating during harsh winter months, and overcrowding that facilitated the spread of infectious diseases. Medical care limited to treating injuries that interfered with work capacity rather than providing comprehensive health support that would ensure proper physical development during critical growth years. The correspondence between industrial supervisors and collecting organizations reveals the calculated exploitation of child workers whose vulnerability made them attractive to enterprises seeking to minimize labor costs and avoid the workplace safety demands that adult workers increasingly organize to achieve through emerging labor union movements. Children couldn't organize for better working conditions or demand adequate compensation for dangerous work. Children couldn't leave industrial facilities to seek alternative employment when conditions became intolerable. Children couldn't advocate for educational opportunities or social development that would enable them to escape industrial exploitation and achieve economic independence. Educational opportunities provided to industrial child workers were restricted to technical training directly related to industrial operations rather than comprehensive education that would enable intellectual development, social advancement, or preparation for adult life outside industrial employment. Mining children received instruction in coal extraction techniques, equipment operation, and underground safety procedures, but no literacy education, mathematical instruction beyond basic, counting, or knowledge of the broader world that would enable them to envision alternatives to mining work. Textile factory children learned machinery operation, quality control, and production efficiency, but received no educational foundation that would prepare them for adult roles as independent citizens capable of participating in democratic society. But perhaps most troubling, the children transported through these industrial shipments rarely appear in subsequent documentation that would trace their adult lives, family formation, community integration, or social advancement that characterized successful outcomes for legitimate orphan train participants who were placed with caring families in agricultural communities. Unlike official Children's Aid Society placements that generated extensive documentation of successful adoptions, ongoing family relationships, educational achievements, and adult outcomes. That demonstrated program effectiveness and justified continued funding and minimal follow-up documentation, and no systematic tracking of long-term outcomes or welfare assessments. The absence of follow-up documentation raises questions about what happened to thousands of children who were transported to industrial destinations during the 1870s and 1880s. Normal child placement programs generated extensive documentation of successful adoptions, ongoing family relationships, and adult outcomes that demonstrated program effectiveness and justified continued funding and operation. The industrial child shipments generated minimal follow-up documentation and no systematic tracking of long-term outcomes. Some correspondence between industrial operations and collecting organizations suggests that child workers were transferred between different industrial sites as projects were completed or as labor needs changed in response to economic conditions and technological developments. Children weren't placed in permanent locations where they could develop stable community relationships. They were moved through industrial systems as labor requirements demanded, preventing the development of normal social attachments and community integration. The broader context of 1879 reveals similar industrial child shipment operations throughout regions experiencing rapid economic development and resource extraction. Mining territories, railroad construction zones, and manufacturing centers throughout the American interior were receiving child workers through transportation networks that paralleled but remained separate from official child welfare programs. The scale of these operations suggests systematic coordination between urban child gathering organizations and industrial enterprises across multiple states and territories. The pattern indicates deliberate development of alternative child placement systems designed to supply industrial labor rather than provide humanitarian assistance to disadvantaged urban youth. While the official Children's Aid Society Orphan Train program focused on placing children with farm families in agricultural communities, the parallel industrial shipment network collected children specifically for dangerous and exploitative work that adult workers avoided or demanded compensation that industrial enterprises preferred not to pay. Modern child welfare standards would never permit the systematic shipment of children to industrial work sites where they would be housed in company facilities and employed in dangerous operations without adequate education, social development, or pathways to adult independence. Contemporary child protection laws specifically prohibit the kind of exploitative labor arrangements that characterized many industrial child placements during the 1870s and 1880s. The systematic use of children as industrial workers represents a form of institutional exploitation that modern society recognizes as fundamentally harmful to child development and human dignity. Pitch 4%, but the Transportation Manifests and Industrial Correspondence from 1879 provide evidence that thousands of children were systematically collected from urban areas and shipped to industrial operations throughout the American interior during a period of rapid economic development that created unprecedented demand for workers willing to accept dangerous conditions and minimal compensation. The children weren't rescued from urban poverty and placed with caring families in agricultural communities. They were harvested from urban populations and delivered to industrial enterprises as exploitable labor. The discrepancy between official orphan train narratives and industrial child shipment documentation, time equals 700 milliseconds / suggests deliberate obscuring of systematic child exploitation that operated alongside humanitarian child welfare programs. While public attention focused on the charitable mission of relocating disadvantaged urban children to rural families, industrial enterprises were quietly developing parallel systems for acquiring child workers through similar transportation infrastructure and organizational networks. Today's historical understanding of orphan trains emphasizes their humanitarian mission and positive impact on both urban poverty reduction and rural family formation throughout American society. The industrial child shipment documentation reveals a darker parallel system that exploited the same social conditions and transportation infrastructure to supply industrial enterprises with exploitable child labor. The children shipped to industrial destinations weren't participants in humanitarian placement programs designed to improve their life circumstances. They were victims of systematic exploitation that used the rhetoric of child welfare to justify industrial labor trafficking. The Railroad Manifest from 1879 document one specific example of how industrial interests systematically exploited child welfare systems during periods of rapid economic development, when labor demand far exceeded what normal recruitment methods could provide through legitimate employment arrangements. The systematic collection and shipment of children to industrial destinations represents institutional child exploitation that operated under humanitarian cover while serving economic interests that consistently prioritized profit over child welfare and basic human development throughout the rapidly industrializing American economy during this period. The children sent to industrial destinations remain largely invisible in historical documentation. That preserves extensive records of successful orphan train placements, but minimal information about outcomes for children shipped to mining operations, manufacturing facilities, and construction sites. Their disappearance from historical records reflects systematic erasure of evidence about institutional child exploitation that would complicate narrative. Time equals 1 second greater than about American industrial development and child welfare progress. But in railroad archives, the shipping manifests remain as historical evidence. Documentation of children transported not to loving families in agricultural communities seeking sons and daughters, but to industrial operations where they would provide exploitable labor. For enterprises that couldn't attract sufficient adult workers through legitimate employment arrangements and fair working conditions. The alternative orphan trains of 1879 revealed the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children. During America's industrial expansion, when rapid economic development and unprecedented industrial growth took precedence over human welfare and child protection.
Nobody likes paying income tax, but very few people know where it actually came from. For most, taxes on goods like whiskey or imported products to fund its operations. But everything changed during the Civil War. The federal government needed a new source of revenue to finance the Union Army, and in 1861, Congress passed the first federal income tax in American history under the Revenue Act of 1861. This tax imposed a flat 3% rate on incomes over $800, equivalent to about $28,000 today. A year later, Congress revised the tax structure, introducing the Revenue Act of 1862, which established the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the early version of what would later become the IRS. Unlike today, tax collection was manual and enforcement was difficult. The federal government employed Nobody likes paying income tax, but very few people know where it actually came from. For most of American history, the federal government didn't tax individual income at all. Instead, it relied on tariffs and excise taxes, taxes on goods like whiskey or imported products, to fund its operations. But everything changed during the Civil War. The federal government needed a new source of revenue to finance the Union Army, and in 1861, Congress passed the first federal income tax in American history under the Revenue Act of 1861. This tax imposed a flat 3% rate on incomes over $800, equivalent to about $28,000 today. A year later, Congress revised the tax structure, introducing the Revenue Act of 1862, which created a progressive tax system where higher earners paid a higher rate. This law also established the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the early version of what would later become the IRS. Unlike today, tax collection was manual and enforcement was difficult. The federal government employed assessors to determine each person's income, which meant tax records were often based on self-reporting, leading to fraud and evasion. Despite these challenges, the tax successfully raised hundreds of millions of dollars to fund the war. At the time, the income tax was seen as a temporary wartime measure, and true to that promise, Congress repealed it in 1872. But during its brief existence, it had set a precedent, one that would return in a few decades. For the next two decades, the federal government relied on tariffs as its primary.
Bang, bang. I'm gonna tell you right now, them jokers was printing the money. They signed that shit into law, but they were printing the money. And they were making bets on the future of the, so to speak, United States that they were forming at that time would pay it back. So again, they didn't collect any money to fund these wars. What they did was print it and said, look at here, shit, they're gonna pay it back. Yeah, America got everything. America has everything. America has everything. Yeah, man. Yeah. The land of everything. Yeah, man. Birth of a who? Yeah. Check it. So they printed the money. That's where the debt comes from. They was printing the money, because they created the fucking Federal Reserve System. They signed it into law. Now private entities, huh? Get to say, yeah. You can print. You can print. Go ahead. But you owe me, bitch. You owe me. Bitch. I want my money back in dollars, bitch. Bang bang.
In 1872. But during its brief existence, it had set a precedent, one that would return in a few decades. For the next 2 decades, the federal government relied on tariffs as its primary source of revenue. But by the late 19th century, the economic landscape was changing. The Industrial Revolution had created vast fortunes for some, while many ordinary Americans struggled under an economy that favored the wealthy elite. Populist and progressive movements pushed for tax reform, arguing that tariffs placed an unfair burden on the working class, while the richest Americans contributed little to government revenue. In 1894, Congress responded by passing the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which included a 2% income tax on those earning over $4,000, about $140,000 today. The tax was designed to target the wealthiest Americans and make the system more equitable. But almost immediately, opposition groups formed, arguing that the new tax was unconstitutional. The biggest challenge was Charles Pollock, a wealthy shareholder of Farmers Loan Trust Co., who filed a lawsuit arguing that the income tax was a direct tax and therefore had to be apportioned among the states according to population. The case, Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Co. in 1895, made its way to the Supreme Court, where the justices ruled that the income tax violated the Constitution. This decision struck down the tax and effectively shut down any future attempt at a federal income tax, at least for the time being. The Pollock ruling fueled even greater demand for reform. Many saw the decision as favoring the rich, protecting their wealth while forcing ordinary Americans to bear the brunt of federal taxation through tariffs. The progressive movement, which was growing in political influence, argued that the government needed the ability to tax income directly. In 1909, President William Howard Taft and Congress proposed the 16th Amendment, which gave the federal government the explicit authority to levy an income tax without apportionment among the states. At first, opposition was fierce. Many believed a direct income tax gave the government too much power over personal wealth. But economic pressures and public sentiment pushed the amendment forward, and it was ratified in 1913. Almost immediately, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913, reintroducing the income tax. The law set a progressive tax structure with rates ranging from 1% for lower income earners to 7% for the wealthiest. Initially, this tax affected only a small percentage of Americans, primarily the rich. But just as before, global events would soon change that. In 1914, World War I broke out in Europe, and by 1917, the United States had joined the fight. War is expensive, and the government needed money fast. Congress responded with the Revenue Act of 1916, which drastically increased income tax rates and expanded who had to pay. The top tax rate jumped from 7% to 77%, making it one of the highest in U.S. history. For the first time, the federal government started using tax withholding, requiring businesses to deduct taxes directly from employees' wages. This made it easier for the government to collect revenue without relying on individuals to file and pay at the end of the year. By the war's end, income tax had become the largest source of government funding. Even after the war, the federal government continued relying on income tax. The 1920s saw tax cuts, particularly under Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, but the system remained in place. Meanwhile, legal challenges sought to define what exactly counted as income. One of the most significant cases was Bruchaber v. Union Pacific Railroad in 1916, where the Supreme Court upheld the 16th Amendment, confirming that Congress had full authority to impose income tax. In Eisner v. Macomber in 1920, the court ruled that stock dividends were not taxable, setting an important precedent on the definition of taxable income. These rulings shaped future tax law and influenced how income was reported. During the Great Depression, tax policy changed dramatically. President Franklin D. Roosevelt raised taxes on the wealthy to fund the New Deal, which provided economic relief programs, but once again, war would change the game. When the U.S. entered World War II, the need for revenue skyrocketed. The Revenue Act of 1942 transformed the income tax system into what we know today. Before the war, income tax had only applied to a small percentage of Americans, but by 1945, it covered nearly everyone. To ensure consistent revenue, the government introduced mandatory payroll withholding, where employers deducted taxes before wages were paid. This system remains in place today. By the end of the war, income tax had become the primary source of federal funding, a position it has held ever since. In the 1950s and 1960s, income tax rates remained high, with the top bracket exceeding 90%. And economic stagnation led to Congress sign the Tax Reform Act, which simplified the tax code, lowered rates, and eliminated many deductions. This reform marked a shift toward a system that aimed to broaden the tax base while reducing individual rates. Despite these changes, debates over income tax have never went away. In the late 20th century, some groups have been advocating for the elimination of income tax altogether, proposing alternatives like the fair tax, which would replace income tax with a national sales tax. Others pushed for a flat tax where everyone pays the same percentage regardless of income. Today, income tax remains the largest source of federal revenue, funding everything from the military to social programs. But debates over tax fairness, rates, and loopholes continue. Some argue that lowering taxes boosts economic growth, while others believe the wealthy should pay more to reduce income inequality. The rise of tax havens, corporate loopholes, and digital transactions have added new layers to the debate. But one thing is certain: the income tax isn't going away anytime soon. From its Civil War origins to its transformation into a mass taxation system, it has become a cornerstone of the US government. So, is the modern income tax system the best way to fund the government, or is it time for a change? Let us know what you think in the comments.